Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who are joining us on our heritage.org website. Remind those viewers that they can submit questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. And for those in-house, we would appreciate your making that last courtesy check that cell phones have been turned off. Thank you very much. And we will post the program within 24 hours on our webpage for everyone's future reference. Hosting our discussion this morning is Jessica Zuckerman, Policy Analyst, Western Hemisphere in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. She studies homeland security with a concentration on Latin America. She researches and writes on border security, counterterrorism, immigration reform, democratic institutions, and the rule of law. Before joining us here in 2009, she was an assistant to Matt Meyer and assisted in researching his book, Homeland Security and Federalism, Protecting America from Outside the Beltway. She received a master's in public administration with an emphasis in federal policy from George Washington University and holds her Bachelor of Arts degree in Spanish and International Relations from Ohio State. Please join me in welcoming Jessica Zuckerman. Jessica?
Thank you, John, and thank you all for joining us today. Today opens our 5th annual Homeland Security Week, Homeland Security 2013, refocusing U.S. counterterrorism efforts in an age of continued threats, here at the Heritage Foundation. Since September 2001, the United States has seen at least 60 terrorist plots aimed at the homeland. Many, indeed increasingly so, would be considered homegrown plots, involving U.S.-born citizens, naturalized immigrants, or those radicalized largely in the United States. Nevertheless, the international terror nexus remains strong. Whether from the Northern Caucasus, the Middle East, Africa, Europe, or elsewhere, terrorism from abroad has struck at the U.S. in the past and will continue to do so in the future. Given this fact, it's important that the United States seek to understand the true scope of the international terror threat and continue to work with our international partners. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished panel today. Speaking first will be Mary Hayback. Mary is an associate professor in strategic studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where she teaches courses on military history and strategic thought. Before coming to SAIS, Dr. Hayback taught American and European military history in Yale's history department. She received her PhD in history from Yale, an MA in international relations from Yale as well, and the one that's closest to my heart, a BA in international studies, Russian and Spanish from The Ohio State University. Dr. Hayback was appointed by President Bush to the Council on the Humanities at the National Endowment for the Humanities and was the Special Advisor for Strategic Planning at the National Security Council staff. Next, we will be joined by Ariel Cohen. Dr. Ariel Cohen brings firsthand knowledge of the former Soviet Union and the Middle East through a wide range of studies, covering issues such as economic development and political reform in the Soviet republics, U.S. energy security, the global war on terrorism, and the continuing conflict in the Middle East. His analyses are often incisive. For example, Cohen warned repeatedly that multi-billion-dollar financial aid to the corrupt Russian government would end up in the wrong pockets, which indeed happened after the 1998 Russian financial crisis. So too, in July 2001, just 2 months before Osama bin Laden's terror network struck the United States, Cohen testified before Congress encouraging the U.S. government to counter the efforts of radical Islamic groups in Central Asia, including the Taliban and Osama bin Laden's organization. Cohen joined Heritage in 1992 and is now a senior research fellow here at Heritage. Finally, we'll be joined by Luke Coffey. Luke Coffey studies and writes on U.S.-UK relations as the Margaret Thatcher Fellow here at the Heritage Foundation. He focuses in particular on defense and security matters, including the role of NATO and the European Union in transatlantic security. Before joining Heritage's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom in 2002, Luke served at the UK Ministry of Defence as Senior Special Advisor to then British Defence Secretary Liam Fox. He was the only non-UK citizen appointed by Prime Minister David Cameron to provide advice to senior British ministers. Coffey's work on British politics followed his service in the United States as a commissioned officer in the Army. He also received a master's degree of science in politics and government of the European Union from the London School of Economics. With that, let me turn it over to Dr. Hayback. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to provide a sort of provocative explanation for some of the reasons, or at least one of the reasons why I believe we've been surprised since 9/11, and especially since 2008, by a series of attacks that have emanated from outside the United States. I'm not going to be talking about homegrown plots or about lone wolves per se, but instead about those sorts of attacks that the entire Homeland Security apparatus was set up to prevent. And yet, since 2008, we've had about a half dozen different attacks that have either failed because of internal problems with the entire apparatus that was used, that is, the bomb failed, or actually succeeded in killing Americans. So let me preface that, though, by saying, in general, our CT efforts have been magnificent. I'm really impressed by the efforts that have been put forward by the entire Homeland Security apparatus. And I believe without it, we would find ourselves in far, far deeper trouble than this half dozen attacks I'm going to talk about would suggest. There's been no follow-up to 9/11 that succeeded. I mean, that in and of itself says the system is working, even if we've had these minor failures. And again, what I'm going to be talking about are minor attacks and some failed plots, rather than hugely successful ones that have, I hate to use the term success anywhere near this, but that have killed large numbers of Americans. So we're doing many things right. And I don't want to make this sound as if this is an indictment of the entire Homeland Security apparatus. Of course, amongst the things that we've done right have been the death of bin Laden and many others who have plotted and planned to kill Americans. But I do believe that we have two related problems that need some sort of corrective to them. The first is the problem of the attacks that have succeeded and have fizzled only because of some sort of problem that the bombers themselves had, not because we got there in time to stop it. And here I'd like to emphasize the attack over Detroit by Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib. But actually, earlier there were two attacks that emanated from the same place, and that is an attack by a guy named, or chose the name, Abdul Hakim Mujahid Muhammad, who carried out a successful attack on a Arkansas recruiting station, Armed Forces recruiting station, and the attack by Nidal Hassan. And I'm putting these in the same category because all three of them emanated, in fact, from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. The second attack that I'd like to highlight is the one that failed in Times Square, but only failed because something Faisal Shahzad did wrong, not because we got there in time and managed to stop him. And finally, the attack in Boston by the Tsarnaev brothers. So, just 5 attacks, I think, in total, that have carried out either minor loss of life, and I hate to say minor, but, thank goodness not the huge loss of life that we suffered on 9/11, or failed because of some sort of internal problem. But they managed to catch us off guard. And I think there is, in fact, an explanation that might help to explain, or will help to at least provide partial explanation for why these attacks in particular managed to get through our Homeland Security net. So that's the first problem that I think I see out there. The second is the problem of the growth and of the strength and reach of Al-Qaeda and its affiliated groups throughout the Muslim majority world. And I see these two problems as actually being related. Just touching on the second problem, though, we have this issue of why Al-Qaeda has grown so wildly in places where they never had a foothold before. Libya, North Africa in general, has just seen this explosion in growth of groups claiming at least to be affiliated in some way with Al-Qaeda. The Sinai, Syria, Iraq, there's just been this huge growth. And I also follow very closely what's been happening in Yemen and Somalia, where allies and partners are fighting Al-Qaeda affiliates as well. And after some initial successes, especially in Yemen, we're seeing a kind of comeback of this very powerful and dangerous affiliated group. And by the way, while most of us have stopped paying attention to Mali because it looks like, the French and the Malian army have won out there, I keep track of the attacks that are carried out or claimed to be carried out by Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and other affiliated groups there. And they're also on the rise and apparently gaining strength after an initial defeat. So you have two problems that on the surface might not look like they're related, except that every single one of the failed attacks or partially successful attacks that I mentioned have emanated from one of these places that has affiliated Al-Qaeda groups or groups that claim some sort of affiliation with Al-Qaeda. And I think that there is an explanation, a partial potential explanation, that ties these two together and might help to explain why we've been surprised since 2008. The truth is that we have a peculiar vision of what constitutes Al-Qaeda. We divide Al-Qaeda into two separate categories of the core, and here I'm quoting the Strategy for Combating Terrorism from 2011, into the core, and then these affiliated groups. The core is envisioned as having the objective of attacking the United States. After all, it was this core leadership that carried out, or at least their inheritors, that carried out 9/11, and that had plotted and planned and threatened Americans around the world. But the affiliated groups, sometime after 2006, 2007, began to be viewed as perhaps having just local concerns and being more concerned with overthrowing local leaders than with attacking the United States. And in fact, the threat that we pay the most attention to is from that core that carried out 9/11 and has made all these threats against us. And we kind of have this vision that other countries, our partners and allies, need to pay attention to the affiliates and what they're up to because their main focus is local and on overthrowing local leaders. But I would argue that, in fact, the core is not the only problem for the U.S. and for attacks on the U.S. Because, first of all, this is not how Al-Qaeda thinks about itself. It's not how it's organized itself, nor is it how Al-Qaeda envisions its strategy. If you listen to what Al-Qaeda actually says about itself and about its strategy, you'd come to quite a different conclusion about where the threat to the United States can emanate from. First, there's the organizational issue. In May and June, two high-ranking leaders in Al-Qaeda, one a leader of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb named Abu Abdullah Ahmed, and the second, a guy named Mustafa Abu Yazid, who described himself as the general manager in an Al Jazeera interview, gave descriptions of Al-Qaeda that are quite at odds with this view of a core and then these affiliates with local sorts of issues. Both of them said that there is a core, but they didn't call it that. They said it's the leadership for a global fight that is located someplace in what they call Khorasan, that is Afghanistan, Pakistan. And it is the sort of trunk or the tree from which branches come off. And these branches are what we call the affiliated groups. The relationship between them then is one of that is organic in nature. That is a completely unified sort of group, not two separate sorts of things. And by the way, Abu Abdullah Ahmed specifically said our strategies and our tactics, our policies are precisely the same as those of the leadership. We have no differences with them. Mustafa Abu Yazid specifically said that the branches are part of us. They are us, in other words. And to remind you, the branches are their term for the affiliates. And in this interview on Al Jazeera, he specifically called on these branches to carry out attacks on the United States. Now, that was in June 2009. And within just a few months, actually 3 separate attacks emanated from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Up to that point, however, the U.S. had viewed Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula as being a local group with a local focus, and we therefore were not giving it the sort of homeland security attention that it deserved. And this is, by the way, also true of the TTP, which has claimed to be behind the attack by Faisal Shahzad, viewed as a local group, which is mostly focused on, obviously, Pakistan and carrying out attacks in Pakistan. And by the way, this also helps to explain the Tsarnaev brothers. They, after all, come from Chechnya, which is a local fight, and one that Russia perhaps needs to pay attention to, but not the United States. In fact, if you look around the world, there are dozens of groups that we believe have local focuses, and yet they have said they have a global focus and that they want to carry out attacks on the United States. So I believe that it's a false dichotomy to divide Al-Qaeda into global versus local pieces and only pay attention to those that we consider to be global parts of this whole. And we can only ignore local groups affiliated in some way with Al-Qaeda to our own peril. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Ariel?
Good afternoon. I think Mary mentioned the Tsarnaev brothers as a good segue to what I'm going to talk about. The Tsarnaev brothers were half Chechen. Their father, who returned from the United States to Chechnya, actually he returned to Dagestan, is, I believe, Chechen, and their mother is Avar, which is a Dagestani ethnic group, the largest in Dagestan. Dagestan is an autonomous republic in the Russian Federation to the east of Chechnya and on the shores of the Caspian. I do not want to get into the ethnic and linguistic nitty-gritty, but it's important. And one of the issues I want to address is that a lot of people in the intelligence community, in the security community, said, oops, we did not expect that. We did not expect those who fight the Russians all of a sudden come to our shores and engage in terrorist activities here in the United States. So while I will not over-dramatize and say that this was a black swan, it was a black sparrow. It was a small bird that caused surprise. However, if you tracked the transition of terrorism in North Caucasus for the last 20 years, from the first Chechen War, 1994 to 96, into the interwar period, 96-99, and then the beginning of the second Chechen War, you would find out that what started as a struggle of national liberation, primarily by secular or moderate Islamic leadership in Chechnya, quickly, and I mean quickly, like within 3 years, transformed into an Islamist, radical, politicized, jihadi-style struggle with connections to the global radical Islamist networks. How so? First of all, the quasi-independent Republic of Ichkeria, which was the self-name of Chechnya, was recognized by one state. Who knows which state it was? It was the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan under the Taliban. So here's the first connection. Second, the Chechens received drugs from Afghanistan for distribution in Russia, Eastern Europe, and Western Europe. So the Chechen networks in exile were the platforms through which drugs went out and money went in, including money for armed struggle in the Caucasus. Additionally, quickly, the collection of zakat, of alms, throughout the networks of mosques from London to Michigan occurred for the jihad, quote unquote, in Chechnya. We witnessed in the late 90s and toward the Second Chechen War, 2000 through 2004, a very quick development of the flow of money, of trainers, of propagandists, and indoctrinators, so that today in North Caucasus, we have a growth of what they call the Jamaat. The Jamaat are self-contained groups of believers, of Salafis, or what is called in the region Wahhabis, of the sort of Saudi brand of radical Islam that includes and promulgates armed struggle against the infidels, as well as against the local traditional Sufi Islam in North Caucasus. Russia was the sixth or the seventh in the world in terms of the number of suicide attacks from 1990 till now. 1,000 attacks, give or take, took place with 3,000 people killed in suicide bombings. They targeted, as in the rest of the world, the weak members of the community, widows, people who lost the dear ones in the wars against Russia. They targeted civilian aircraft. 2 of them were blown out of the sky because an airport guard took a $100 bribe, a $300 bribe in the Domodedovo airport in Moscow. They targeted fast trains that derailed and killed people. They targeted theaters. Some of the largest hostage taking in the world took place in Russia. The Dubrovka Theater, the Beslan School, and others. Buynaksk, 1,000 people in the hospital, 500 people in the theater, 300 plus people in a school. And unfortunately, the Russian response was weak. They managed to kill not just the hostage takers, but the hostages themselves. I do have papers on this on heritage.org. If you type North Caucasus and my name, you will find the papers. And in one of these articles, actually, I did predict that there will be terrorist activities emanating from North Caucasus in this country. The outlook for North Caucasus is pretty grim. The population is growing very fast, much faster than the slowly declining ethnic Slavic Russian Orthodox population in the rest of the country. There's a friction between the Slavs and the North Caucasian Muslims in Russia, throughout Russia, wherever the diaspora lives. There are fights, there are knives, there are guns, there are beatings, and this is not a good metric, especially that even 20 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia is still struggling with self-identification. If you ask in Moscow or in Saratov or in Novosibirsk, who is Ruski, who is Russian, you'll get all kinds of answers, and more often than not, it will be defined through ethnicity, through faith, and not through citizenship. Россияне, the citizens of Russia, is a term that is not deeply entrenched in today's Russian discourse. I'm writing a paper for the War College, which is at this count about 53 pages. And among other things, I'm looking at different scenarios. I would say the most probable scenario is muddled through. As oil is in 3 figures per barrel price, there's enough money to sort of throw at the problem. It's not only in this country people throw money at the problem, it's also in Russia and in other places. So what do? They came up with this ridiculous scheme of developing ski resorts in North Caucasus while people are still shooting RPGs at each other. And I had my doubts until they tried to open a resort and the first batch of tourists arrived from Moscow and a minibus was shot up and they killed a young woman who came to ski in North Caucasus. So no skiing anytime soon there. They tried to develop, they did develop Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, pretty decently. They got some Turkish money for a huge mosque. They built up the main street, which is called the Putin Avenue. Surprise, surprise. And the local ruler in Chechnya is very tough, very rough. There are a lot of publications about corruption that Mr. Kadyrov, the son, the Kadyrov Jr., is involved in, including some level of control of the real estate market in Moscow. But whatever it is a status quo that Moscow is happier than the alternative. And the other options in the scenarios is that Moscow loses control both militarily and economically, and the radical Islam is just spreading and spreading there, and because of the demographics, more and more young people are joining the ranks of the fighters. So that is not a good solution. The best case scenario, which is also unlikely, is that the level of extremism and the extremists themselves are so few and the level of extremism is so low that a real economic development can take place. It becomes more receptive for foreign investment, but the levels of corruption are such that I do not see this happening anytime soon. So muddle through is probably the best case scenario for North Caucasus right now. And clearly for us, we need to talk to law enforcement and security services in the region, and then the question arises, can we really talk to law enforcement and secret services in Russia? And this is a serious question because we do have our own security concern, as Boston clearly showed, but at the same time, these parts of the security services do things that are deeply distasteful for us, including crackdown on political opponents, including sometimes provision of protection, clearly protection services for organized crime. And the cases of protection of underground gambling in Moscow, in which prosecutors were arrested and prosecutors were released and fingers were pointed both ways, indicate that when we deal with the Russian law enforcement and secret services, we have to deal at arm's length and go into these relationships with eyes wide open and deep knowledge of who we're dealing with. Let me move to Central Asia now. In Central Asia, next year is a key year. 2014, it is a real watershed as the United States and NATO troops are pulling out of Afghanistan. And several things can happen. We may have somehow a scenario in which the government in Kabul holds against the Taliban, and I wish and pray that that will happen. But when you travel in Central Asia, a lot of people do not believe it. The best thing they believe, like President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan, said, well, let's not dramatize, let's hope and pray that whatever happens in Afghanistan, it's not going to spill over. And then informally, government officials in Central Asia tell me, we think there will be some kind of spillover effect. If Taliban overruns Afghanistan, we're back to status quo ante 2001, when Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, Islamic movement of Turkestan, newly active Hizb ut-Tahrir al-Islami, the Islamic Party of Liberation, and other organizations, Muslim Brotherhood and others, are active. And we saw already, for example, in a country that had very little in terms of terrorism, Kazakhstan, in the last years, the trend is small but unmistakably towards the increase. Same is the case in weaker countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Uzbekistan is also a key country to watch because currently there's a harsh authoritarian regime in Uzbekistan, but it's secular and it keeps things under control. If and when President Karimov moves out of power, probably for biological reasons, there will be a power struggle, and the question is that is going to be the time when Islamist radicals are going to make a move, as they tried to do in Andijan in 2005, when the events that were triggered by Islamists caused the government to react in a very heavy-handed way, and hundreds of people were shot, and Uzbekistan was punished by the international community. But let's not forget, there was an underlying reason of Islamist uprising in Andijan. So Kyrgyzstan, as we saw in 2010 with the Osh uprising, is weak. Tajikistan is a mess with massive drug running and corruption and GDP per capita somewhere in the vicinity of $1,000 per capita a year. So you have enough corruption and enough poverty and enough Islamist indoctrination with people sort of floating from Pakistan, from madrasas in India, from the Middle East, mainly the Salafi Wahhabi brand, and then it's only a short step towards armed struggle against the secular regimes, even if distasteful, at least these are the regimes we can deal with. And then the challenge, as we're going to bail out, the challenge for Russia and for China is to find the ways to deal with that, to support the governments that are in different types of alliances, whether they are members of the Commonwealth Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or have strong bilateral relations in the security field, primarily with Russia, in economic field, more and more with China. So these are challenges. The more lack of governability you encounter in Central Asia and North Caucasus, the higher are the chances that this will spill over not just across the region, not just into Russia or into Uyghur, Xinjiang region of China, but also into Western Europe and in the United States. Just last point, there were arrests in Western Europe, in Belgium and France, of North Caucasus operatives in terrorist cells. Not too many, but they found weapons and explosives. So this is something to watch, both in Western Europe and in the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Errol. I'm sure everybody's eager to plan their ski trips to Chechnya now. Luke, over to you.
Great, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see such a high attendance for an event like this, especially when the Duchess of Cambridge is in labor. I just checked my phone, and she has not given birth yet, so I'm sure everyone else is checking to make sure what's going on. But in the meantime, I hope I can have your attention while we all wait with such enthusiasm. Yeah, I'm going to focus my comments on the European dimension to allow this. You've already heard very detailed analysis about the Islamic fundamentalist threat, the terrorism threats from different parts of the world. I will focus my comments primarily on Europe and how that ties into the U.S. and how there's a lot of overlap between the U.S. and our European partners. For Americans, I think 9/11 really brought Islamic fundamentalism and Islamic terrorism home to us. And in general, it really brought terrorism home to us because of the sheer scale of that event. So since 2001, this has driven a lot of policy. It's been the topic of countless discussions, of conferences, of panel discussions like this, and it's sort of led us to where we are today. But if you think about it, an 18-year-old private fighting in Afghanistan today was 6 years old when September 11th happened. So that young soldier, Marine, airman, or sailor, all he or she has known, really, in terms of growing up and then now into his or her military career, is this sort of big international threat of terrorism to the U.S. But many of our European partners have been dealing with some sort of terrorism to some degrees, varying levels, for a lot longer time, especially in the recent history. Now, this isn't to minimize things like the Oklahoma bombing in '94 or the World Trade Center bombing in '93 or any of that, but just to show that my point is our European partners have, especially in case of the Brits, have been dealing with terrorism on a more robust basis for a longer period of time. So that being said, I will focus on three aspects, and then I will move into a little bit about why all of this matters to the U.S. And the three areas will be Al-Qaeda and other Islamic fundamentalist groups in Europe and also specifically in the UK. Now I'll touch a bit on Hezbollah in Europe and their activities there and some of the recent developments taking place. And then I'll touch briefly on why Europe has had its hands full with nationalists or domestic terrorism and how that pertains to the U.S. Across Europe, Al-Qaeda has made its presence known, along with other Islamic fundamentalism. The 2005 Madrid train bombing, for example, killed 191 people and wounded more than 2,000. But let's look at the UK more specifically. The UK is America's #1 intelligence and security partner, and this is why this matters to the U.S. Now, in 2010, during their most recent Strategic Defense and Security Review, the United Kingdom designated international terrorism as the #1 threat to the UK. And I think many in this room would agree that is a logical conclusion to come to. And I think many of us in the U.S. probably share this same view. Between 1999 and 2010, there were at least 9 major Al-Qaeda-linked terrorist plots directed against the UK. The most notable one that many in this room have heard of was the so-called 7/7 bombings, the July 7th of 2005 bombings of the London public transport system, which saw 52 killed and dozens more wounded. But just a couple weeks after that bombing, there was a copycat attempted bombing. 4 more bombs were discovered on the London transport system. The UK has experienced many more since then. 2007, car bombs were found in a very popular nightclub district in London. That same year, there was a car bomb attack on Glasgow Airport. That was an attempted attack. It wasn't quite as successful as the individual that went to perpetrate it hoped, because of some courageous act by a security guard at the airport that spotted what was happening and took matters into his own hands. In fact, British intelligence sources have claimed that there's a minimum of 200 potential suicide plots being planned at any given time in the U.S. at various levels, of course. So it's not as if there are 200 plots ready to go tomorrow, but at in various stages in its planning, of around 200, which is a considerable amount. This ties in to a lot of what Mary said about the core Al-Qaeda and how this kind of fits into terrorism in the UK. It was mentioned that there's this idea, especially by the administration, that core Al-Qaeda is sort of defeated on the ropes or whatever, but now there's these we know that there are these branches of Al-Qaeda, whether it's Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQAM, or AQAP that was mentioned in detail by Mary, Al-Shabaab in Somalia. These organizations are the big threat, actually, to Europe right now in terms of Al-Qaeda-linked terrorist attacks. Take Al-Shabaab, for example, in Somalia. Intelligence figures giving testimony in the House of Commons have noted that dozens of British/Somali citizens have made their way to Somalia, have been trained, and they fear that dozens have probably come back into the UK, where they could be planning attacks. In fact, we are probably familiar with the recent barbaric attack on a young British soldier on the streets in London. One of the two alleged perpetrators was arrested in Kenya a couple years ago, trying to illegally cross into Somalia, allegedly try to join or receive training from Al-Shabaab there. So if you look at this in a broader context, you start to see this two-way street, where you see this sort of terrorist activity taking place in Europe and also in the UK, but you also see, for lack of better words, I guess, Europe also exporting this to other regions in the world. It's estimated that there are hundreds of fighters with some sort of European citizenship fighting in Syria today. And they go there and they will fight, they get even more radicalized, and then they will work their way back, in some cases relatively undetected. But even with all of this being said, even with the potential terrorist attacks that are in the pipelines, even with the terrorist attacks that have taken place, even with all the Irish Republican terrorism that took place during the Troubles, which I'll go into a bit of detail later, the single largest terrorist attack on the United Kingdom was actually 9/11, when 67 British citizens were killed in the World Trade Center. So I guess that illustrates probably the best way how we're all in this together. This is all linked together. Moving on to Hezbollah. Now, I had these comments prepared about why the European Union is weak and feeble, and how it's pathetic that they won't designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. And then I got on my train this morning, I'm checking Twitter, and I see that the European Union this morning actually, finally, after years of pressure by many sides, have designated the military wing of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, which is a step in the right direction. It's not the ideal situation. Many rightfully argue that the political side and the military side, are inseparable. I think that as well, but at least it's a step in the right direction for the European Union to designate Hezbollah, the military wing of Hezbollah, as a terrorist organization. This doesn't mean that the U.S. should stop applying pressure on our European partners to designate the full organization as a terrorist organization. We need to realize that this is one of the few policy competencies that has not been delegated to Brussels, and the nation states maintain a degree of sovereignty on this issue, and that if there was political will to do so, an individual European Union member state could designate both sides as terrorist organizations. Up until today, the only two countries in the European Union that designated Hezbollah as a terrorist organization were the UK and the Netherlands. Now, the UK only designates the military wing, like the agreement made by the EU today, but the Netherlands actually designates the whole group as a terrorist organization. So the U.S. needs to really focus on our European allies to say, well, you know what, you can take this a step further. You don't need to be limited by the bureaucracy of the European Union and Brussels. You can take this a step further, and it's in the benefit of your national security. It's in the benefit of America's national security. And this is why Hezbollah has had a long history in operating in Europe or against Europe. Hezbollah killed 58 French paratroopers in a truck bomb in 1983, on the same day that it killed 241 American servicemen in part of the multinational peacekeeping force in Lebanon. In 1985, Hezbollah killed 18 Spanish citizens while targeting a restaurant near a U.S. airbase in Spain. In that same year, 1985, Hezbollah terrorists hijacked TWA Flight 847 after its departure from Athens, Greece, held the crew and the passengers hostage for about 2 weeks, and ended up killing an American soldier that was on that plane. Hezbollah launched a series of attacks against France in retaliation of French support for Iraq during the early 80s Iraq-Iran war, which saw 13 people killed and 250 wounded over a span of 15 different attacks against targets in France. Most recently, a Cypriot court convicted a member of Hezbollah for plotting a terrorist attack against Israeli tourists in Cyprus, and probably the straw that broke the camel's back on the recent decision by the EU to finally designate at least part of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization was the July 2012, so it's just been slightly over a year ago, at Hezbollah, well, the official conclusions aren't out, but all indications are pointing that was a Hezbollah attack in Burgas, Bulgaria, that killed 5 Israeli tourists, their bus driver, and wounded quite a few others, over 20 more. So, Hezbollah has had a history of operating in Europe or against European targets. And, now that the European Union has designated at least part of the organization as a terrorist body, it will help it'll help curtail its criminal activities, its financing, its fundraising activities on the continent. It'll hopefully bring down some of the political legitimacy that Hezbollah has enjoyed in Europe. And hopefully more of these suspects will be prosecuted under anti-terrorism laws. But, it remains to be seen. The announcement was just made. To what degree will this designation go into force? Will there possibly be an expansion of this over time to include the whole organization? Nobody knows. And then the third point, and I just want to touch on this briefly because it sort of strays away from the main topic of the panel, but it's still interlinked nevertheless, and that is some of the domestic challenges that Europeans face in terms of domestic or nationalist terrorism. Many times we don't hear much about this in the U.S., but Italy, for example, in the 70s, had a big problem on their hands with the Red Brigade, a Lenin Marxist terrorist organization that had a number of political objectives, including removing Italy from NATO. In the 70s, a total of 75 people were killed through a number of attacks from them. So, for Italy, terrorism, has been an ongoing issue. In Spain, Basque separatists and ETA, since the 50s, have been responsible for over 800 deaths. They will declare a ceasefire, violate the ceasefire, declare a ceasefire, violate the ceasefire. Most recently, they declared a ceasefire in October 2011, but before that, they declared a ceasefire in 2006, and they violated that ceasefire. So who knows what's going to happen with the future of Basque separatism in Spain, if they'll pursue a peaceful path or revert back to violence. And then you have the Irish Republican Army and the issue between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland during the Troubles in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. Yes, violence and separatist activity has decreased, but it's still out there. And just some examples. In 2012, British Explosive and Ordnance Disposal responded to 318 incidents last year in 2012. That's almost once a day. In Northern Ireland, excuse me, I should have made that clear. Not all in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, just in Northern Ireland. July 16th, just last week, 6 pipe bombs, homemade devices, were thrown at police during some rioting. Right before a couple weeks before the G8 summit in Northern Ireland, a car bomb that was targeting a local police station where the G8 summit was going to be held was discovered and dismantled. And only in 2009, the 2 British soldiers were killed in a terrorist attack by separatists when they ordered pizza and they went out to collect the pizza, and the terrorists were waiting and shot them dead. And that was actually the last time that a British service member was killed as a result of real IRA activity. So how does this all matter to the U.S.? Well, there are a lot of reasons why terrorist activity in Europe and how Europe reacts to it matters to us. I mean, the obvious example is the one I gave about 9/11 being the single largest terrorist attack against the United Kingdom, is because we're all in this together. in the 21st century, globalization, the interdependent economy that we all have to live in and operate in and live with means that, we're all interconnected in a way that we haven't been before. And with Europe in particular, and when I mean Europe, I mean the individual states in Europe and not the European Union, we share a lot of shared values and shared culture in many cases, shared history. So many of America's closest and oldest allies are in Europe. So they're our friends, put it simply. And when what happens to them is in our interests, and what happens to us is also in their interests. And also, the enemy doesn't tell a difference. The sort of enemy that we're facing in terms of Islamic fundamentalism, it can be a U.S. target, or it can be a German target. To them, they really don't care. I mean, I saw when I served in Afghanistan in the army, the enemy didn't really care if you had the American flag on your shoulder, or if you had a British flag or an Italian flag or whatever. To them, you were a foreigner on their land, and you became a single, all-encompassing target. And we need to realize that quite often this is the way that a lot of our adversaries in the world view the West, which is a very general term for us, but to them is a very specific target, actually. And also, it matters what happens in Europe because we have 65,000 U.S. troops and their families still based there, which are prime terrorist targets. So it is in our interest that Europeans keep up their game on counterterrorism, because quite often U.S. service personnel are the target of the terrorist plan. And also, when it focuses on some of the domestic terrorism that takes place, whether it's Irish Republican terrorism in Northern Ireland, or whether it's Basque separatists in Spain, this takes resources to follow and to counter. And these are the resources that aren't focused on maybe international terrorism. So, it's in America's interest that some of these terrorist activities that take place that really don't affect the U.S. directly, like Basque separatism, is somehow resolved, because that means Spain, for example, could offer more resources towards, more of a global threat. And then finally, I'll say with how it matters to the U.S. is because terrorist attacks can affect U.S. foreign policy objectives and goals. Terrorist attacks in Europe can, and for example, with the train bombing in Spain, that forced the Spanish government to bring Spanish troops home from Iraq, and has now made the Spanish people shy from these sort of overseas interventions, the merits of which can be debated until the cows come home. But nevertheless, as a NATO ally, and with all the global challenges we face, we need to make sure that our allies but explain to their public why there is a global threat and we're all in this together. And having a terrorist attack completely alter a foreign or defense policy of a country shows our enemies how easily it can be done. And that does impact the U.S. And the NATO alliance, for that matter. So in conclusion, I hope something I've said might have sparked something in your mind for the Q&A. Europe's been dealing with terrorism to various degrees for a long time, and we have a lot that we can learn from them, and they also have a lot we can learn from us. And the important takeaway here is that we are all in this together, and we need to make sure that the intelligence sharing and cooperation continues. All this stuff about WikiLeaks, all this stuff about Snowden and all this, these are frankly sideshows compared to some of the big challenges that we all face together. And we need to make sure that we don't let some of these road bumps along the way prevent real cooperation that will save real lives. With that, I will.
Thank you, Luke.
Thanks.
All right, we're quickly running out of time, so I'm going to open it up to Q&A. We have microphones coming around. I'm going to ask that you state your name and any affiliation, and please make your question a question, not a monologue. Okay, thank you. Here.
Hi, my name is Lex McCusker. Could I ask each of you to say a few words about the connectedness of the Tsarnaev brothers? Were they a pair of lone wolves, or to what extent are they part of a larger network?
Mary, Ariel, either of you?
The older brother is a real piece of work. He traveled to the region when he did, I think, if I remember the news reports correctly, the Russians pinged our authorities. Our authorities went back to the Russians, started asking questions, and the communication broke down. I do not have time to go into the detailed description about Russian-American relations right now. But let me put it this way. If we had a relationship with Russia like we have with the United Kingdom or with Germany or with Israel or with India, probably the communications would not have broken down, and maybe we would have gotten more information that for sure the Russians had, that the older Tsarnaev brother was running with very bad guys, including the leaders of some of the Islamist groups in Dagestan. The Russian North Caucasus terrorist network is leaking. I was in a South Caucasus country, there's only 3, so you have 3 guesses, and there people told me that from their country, some of the Sunni Muslims, that they have Sunnis and they have Shia in South Caucasus. From that country, a couple of hundred Sunnis went to fight in Syria. And I said, what about people to your north, in North Caucasus? They said, 600 to 800. And this was this past May. So the Tsarnaev brothers were a part of a global network. To what extent operationally, we don't know, and I very much hope that the people who are paid to know. I hope. There are problems because, for example, how many people in the American intelligence community do you think are speaking Avar or Chechen, which is a very difficult language, or even
Abkhaz is worse.
Abkhaz is worse, but there's not a lot of evidence that Abkhaz are very active in this kind of business. What I'm trying to say is we have a choice. We can expend resources and educate our guys and gals in culture, language, religion, geography, etc., or we can cooperate with foreign services and keep in mind always that a foreign service, even a friendly foreign service, let's say the French, would filter very heavily, as would we, in communications on sensitive subjects with a sister service.
Thank you, Ariel.
Can I? Yeah. So, there's been very little information that's come out about any sort of direct connection with, for instance, the Caucasus, which has some sort of tie or relationship to Al-Qaeda, but is, again, very murky, between, let's say, the Caucasus and the Tsarnaev brothers. But what I was interested in was the ideology that they espoused, the reasons that they might have carried out this attack, and the fact that there is some sort of connection between at least this older brother and something called the Dagestani. What do they call themselves? Jamaat, yeah. Right. First of all, the ideology. If you take a look at the stuff that he had up on his YouTube page and other places, the Facebook page and so on and so forth, it was pretty clear to me that it was a jihadi Salafist orientation that he had. And the guys who are the absolute kings of the jihadi Salafism is, of course, Al-Qaeda. This is a very, very specific version of Islam. It has nothing to do with Salafism and nothing to do with other versions of jihadism. And it's so specific that I decided after looking at his biography and the mosque that he went to that he was in fact radicalized twice. First by the Ikhwani mosque that he went to, where he became,
Explain.
oh,
people
sorry, the
don't know.
Brotherhood, Muslim Brotherhood mosque that he went to first, and I think he got
That's the guys
radicalized.
who visit the White House.
But this is, to be very fair, these guys are not preaching violence at this mosque, and in fact, we're horrified by some of the things he started to
Very
say
nice guy.
after he'd been there for a while. But, to be fair, they in fact reported him after he became radicalized again. I have my suspicions about how, because there's this really radical mosque in the Boston outskirts that apparently he attended, and a group of people have been radicalized in that area, including a woman named Afia Sadiqi, who's currently in prison for having some sort of engagement with Al-Qaeda. So I have my suspicions about how he got radicalized, but I think, got no proof, but his ideology was definitely jihadi Salafism and not Muslim Brotherhood. And that's the first thing. The second thing is, I went back and looked at his YouTube page, the one that got erased, and you could actually find the YouTube videos that got erased for violation of terms of use by YouTube/Google on the Dagestani Jamaat website. And so I took a look, to see what was, what sort of things he was espousing by having these up on his webpage. And it was absolutely jihadi Salafism. And by the way, this particular video was a direct threat to kill anybody who cooperated with the Russian government and opposing the jihadi Salafists in Dagestan. So direct connections with, who knows, but the fact that the Russian authorities were in contact with the FBI and others and had some sort of information about him, but those were put off as apparently because this was seen as a local issue and not one that really affected the United States. It was about Russia, people felt, and not about the U.S., is why I take this as a cautionary tale, that we tend to put these groups into these categories.
We're running out of time.
Yeah, just
Okay.
a quick thing. The question is of the outlook. If you are a law enforcement agency directed and guided by lawyers, you will interpret, and I'm telling you as a lapsed lawyer, you will interpret available evidence, like what you found on a website, in an exculpatory fashion. You'll try to say, oh, this is not dangerous because X, Y, Z. If you're looking at it from the intelligence perspective, you should be interpreting it in a accusatory or in a way to try to connect the dots. He went to Dagestan. He was running there with violent people. These guys, you mentioned the Emirat Kafkaz, the Emirate of the Caucasus, which is mostly a figment of imagination of these radicals, but they're building towards it. They're working towards it. And that is creation of a Sharia-based jihadi state in North Caucasus. And these are supported, for example, by the Al-Qaeda magazine, Inspire, that is now appearing in Russian.
So we are already over by almost 10 minutes now. So what I'm going to do is hopefully our panelists can stay and answer some questions if they're available. I hate to do this, but I don't want to keep everybody way over. So those who are interested, thank you, my panel, for joining us, and hopefully you could join us again on Thursday.